Hello, everybody. Welcome to BeerSmith Podcast number 37. We've got Brewing Like a Monk today. We're going to be talking about how to brew Belgian beers. I got a big announcement today. BeerSmith 2.1 is coming out in mid-May. Looking forward to that. I've been working on it for several months now. Has two major features. First, a brew day timer, which gives you step-by-step instructions, as well as a timer with an alarm. The other major feature, of course, is the BeerSmith Cloud, which is perhaps the major thing I've been working on. It gives you a cloud folder in your BeerSmith software that allows you to share recipes across machines. So let's say you have a desktop and a laptop. You want to be able to work across those two machines. This gives you a very easy way to access a set of shared recipes from both machines just by logging into your cloud folder. I went way beyond that, though. I actually built an entire recipe website around this. So you can go into that cloud folder now and mark something as shared, and now it's going to show up for the entire world to see on our new website. And even just in the beta test, we have several hundred recipes available online, just from a handful of beta users, and I'm sure we're going to have several thousand shortly after launch. It allows you to share a recipe, publish it for anybody to see. You can search these recipes by text. You can search it just by typing in Irish Red. You'll see all the Irish Red recipes, for example. You can search by style. You can search by rating. You can use different keywords. There's a number of social media functions built in, so you can bookmark recipes. You can download the recipes that you bookmark. You can move them to your cloud folder, create a private copy of them, which gives you instant access to those recipes from inside of BeerSmith. You can follow your friends. You can rate other recipes. There's a whole bunch of things you can do on the site. Really looking forward to that launch. The upgrade to BeerSmith 2.1 is going to be free for all existing BeerSmith 2 users. And the cloud service is going to be free for a basic account, and you'll be able to buy additional storage if you like on that, depending on what your needs are. And now, without further ado, I'd like to jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is Stan Hieronymous, who is the author of Brew Like a Monk, Brewing with Wheat, and also the author of an upcoming book called For the Love of the Hops. Stan, it's great to have you back on the show.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Now, you also run a active blog at AppalachianBeer.com. I'm going to spell that out because it's not spelled like the Appalachian Mountain chain. It's Appalachian, AppellAtion Beer.com, where he covers a wide range of topics. Stan, do you want to just maybe say a couple words about the blog? I think it's an interesting blog. I've read quite a bit of it, actually.
Well, it's the blog actually began after Brew Like a Monk. And in visiting the monastery breweries, you get a real sense of the place has something to do with what the beers turn out like. And of course, there was a time when Chimay was expanding that they contracted with Koenigshaven, which is Latrop beers up in the Netherlands. But they thought their water was so important that they put Chimay water, in tanker trunks and hauled it up to Latrop. So I don't really like the word terroir because it connotes wine, and it seems like a lot of gobbledygook. But there are many aspects related to beer and breweries, including hops, that are certainly the same as what the wine people call terroir.
Excellent.
And appellation, denotes it comes from a certain place.
I see. Well, Stan, you wrote what many of us consider to be the definitive book on Belgian, Trappist, and Abbey ales. How'd you get started on that project?
It's a goofy story. When Ray Daniels took charge of Brewers Publications, he formed an advisory committee, and I sat on that committee. And he was asking what books needed to be done. And if you look at designing great beers, you'll notice there's this sort of wide hole where Belgium is usually located. And he had no Belgian-style beers. And it seemed like either he needed to update that book, which he's sort of in the process of doing. He's supposed to be doing. And about that time, Phil Markowski came to Brewers Publications, and he wanted to do a complete book on Belgian-related beers. Ray, being bright enough, recognized for a brewer to get all that done inside of about 10 years would be a bit much. and he broke it into 3 books that became Farmhouse Ales, Wild Brews, and a book that was going to be called Monk Ales. Tommy Arthur was going to write that book. Then he came to his senses. That was shortly before they started Lost Abbey, and he realized he wouldn't have time to get it done. And when he told Ray that, Ray called me and said, Tommy's not going to be able to do the book. And he asked me for suggestions, and I'm sort of running through my head, and I said, well, Rob Todd's starting to branch out further past his white ale, which is still 80% of his sales. But I'm not sure how he would be as an author, and I probably brought up a few other names. And Ray says to me, I thought you'd like to write the book. And I said, you're nuts. It's always my goal not to write technical books. We did the Brewpub Cookbook, we did the Guide to Bars. We tended to write about more culture, we being my wife and I, and more the cultural aspects. And I didn't really want to write a technical sort of book. And I told Ray this. And I hung up the phone, and my office was in a corner of the house. And I walked out in the main room and said to my wife, you won't believe what Ray just asked me about. So I told her. And she looked at me, and she said, so this means we get to go to Belgium, right? And I said, I guess I'm calling him back. And that's basically how I came to write the book. And all of a sudden, I found myself writing about technical matters, and For the Love of Hops will be the 3rd book that is basically for brewers.
Mm-hmm.
So
now the book...
that's how I got started on it.
No, that's great. The book sort of covers the history of Belgian ales in quite a bit of depth. Can you walk us through some of the history behind the Trappist and Belgian and Abbey ales? I think it's kind of interesting.
Well, the important parts to remember, first of all, is Belgium's not 200 years old. And when we talk about monastery breweries, we're talking about breweries across Europe, in places that were different countries then. So there were many monastery breweries in Germany, and there still are a few. But the monasteries were the important brewing centers, starting at the time of Charlemagne. He supported these breweries, and that's where what was in brewing science was advanced. They were the first to cultivate hops, all of those sort of things. So they were the first places outside the home where there was brewing, and they were somewhat of a map for commercial breweries that came after that. But talking about the Trappist beers, you've got to realize that Napoleon acted somewhat like Prohibition in the United States. He wiped them out. He took the monasteries off the face of the map. So you get to the beginning of the 19th century, and these monasteries were either in ruins or they didn't exist at all. So Orval goes back to the 12th century, but then it's empty for 500 years until the 1930s. So there was kind of a reset. They've got the tradition of the monasteries, and certainly, the important part is the Trappist breweries are a subset of the Benedictines. You'll find quite a few more Benedictine monasteries. They just don't happen to brew in Belgium anymore. They did brew as recently as the 1950s. And part of that tradition was certainly that they served travelers was important, but the most important thing is the rule of St. Benedict is that the monks had to support themselves with their work and making beer, and they made beer for themselves. They made their beer for travelers who went through, but eventually they made beer that they could sell, and that supported their work. And in a sense, it was a commercial venture, and their beer had to be of quality that people would buy it, and In the case of Belgium and the Trappist monasteries into the 20th century, that Trappist mark was a brand of quality beer.
Can you give us an overview of what the major styles are?
Well, you know, within the easiest thing is if you're you are involved in homebrew competitions, it's category 18 with a little 16E thrown in on the side, which is Orval. So you've got a style called blonde, although no monasteries make that particular style. But it was some abbey beers are in that style. And important. So within Belgium, you've got 6 Trappist monasteries making beer on premise. You've got one in the Netherlands, which was called Trappist, then briefly was not called Trappist because they're a little bit of politics. And then you have multiple abbey ales. And some abbeys used to have breweries. And then eventually didn't. And then some of them never had breweries, like Leff. There hasn't been a brewery at Leff in forever. So they contracted with a large brewer to make the beer for them, and then it raises money for the monastery. Affligem is a sort of a unique setting because the monks no longer brew there. They owned a brewery nearby. They were involved in the ownership in a brewery nearby. And then Heineken since bought that brewery. So Heineken actually owns the brewery where Affligem is made. But it's not a big enough brand. They would brew it anyplace else. And there's nothing else they can make at that brewery. So it's not like they're going to take that space and come in and make pale lagers. They got open fermentation there and things like that. So in that sense, the Belgian Blonde, 18A, is referred to as an abbey beer. As importantly as anything, it's a beer of about the same strength as a Dubbel, but it's pale. Then you have a Dubbel, and that's the closest connection to the old style back to the 19th century. A Dubbel would be much like the best-selling beer for Chimay in 1880. It's not the same recipe. It's a little bit different, but that would be the closest, which was a beer with some color, about 7-8% alcohol, and then of course with the unique fermentation character. Then there were stronger dark beers, which include anything from above 8% up to more like 10 or 11%. When you see them referred to like the Rochefort 6, 8, and 10, those were Belgian degrees. So it's a little bit different than what we think of as the UK gravity points.
So what are these Belgian degrees? What is that?
It's a measure. It's a different gravity measure.
So kind of like a Plato measurement or a specific gravity.
Except for them. And so the 6, 8, and 10, and that's comparable, of course, to St. Sixtus or West Fletwern, that they've got an 8 and a 12. And so they're all dark and very strong. And then Ockel, which of course is relatively new, they did brew before World War I. They are a brew pub. You can go visit the brew pub and get beer on premise. And so they have 2 beers that are 5s, and a light and a dark, and you can get that on draft at the brewery. Then they make stronger dark and blonde colored for sale, and then they make a very strong dark, the Ockel Extra. And then, let's see, so we've got Rochefort 6, 8, 10. Orval makes 1 beer. They make 2. Orval, and then they make a beer that basically they add water to light that they sell in the inn near the brewery, and I think they're distributing in a few other areas now.
Well, those are the major Dubbels, right?
And Westmalle.
Westmalle. Okay.
And Westmalle was the first modern one, and modern, importantly enough, and this is in the 1920s, and they were the first to use sugar in making the beer, specifically to add strength and without adding body. So you had what the Belgians refer to as it's very digestible. And we think of it in terms of it's well attenuated.
Right.
So that was the other of the Dubbel. And I would say Rochefort 6 is a Dubbel, because it's that strength, of a little different body, and a little different yeast character.
Now, after the Dubbels, we go into the...
You've got, at the Trappist side, you've got triples. And the first triple is in the 1930s, and that's at Westmalle. They produced the triple when they did an expansion in the new brewery. And that's basically, above 8% and pale in color. And in the case of Westmalle, the upper 30s in BU. So it's got a lot of hop punch as well, which often surprises people. In Chimay's, not quite as hoppy, but it's still, relatively hoppy. And then the play off that, and the other style, which is in the book, which is the Golden Strong. And that, of course, is defined by Duvel. But there were many more Belgian Strongs around in Belgium before, and they continue to now, that are not nearly as attenuated, so you can have versions of those that are pretty doggone sweet. And people have some trouble telling the difference between a triple and a Golden Strong, and it's a rather fine line.
I see. So, what is the difference in your mind?
Well, in my mind, it may seem unfair to define a style by a single beer, but you drink Duvel and you drink Westmalle, then you're going to understand the difference. And it's just that extra spice character that's part of the Westmalle yeast.
Now, you've touched on several of the techniques already. You mentioned candy sugar and a few other things, but what are some of the unique techniques that you found as you were going through your research that they use?
It's not, I think by a bit of luck, the first stop I made in Belgium when I visited all the monasteries wasn't a monastery, it was Duvel. And Hedvig Neven is in charge of brewing there. And technically he oversees brewing at Brewery Ommegang in New York as well, because Morgat owns that brewery. And we started talking after touring the brewery, when he judged in World Beer Cup, what mistakes he saw American brewers making. And the conversation led to attenuation and digestibility. And therefore it made it easy for me to continue that conversation every brewery I went to. To back up just a second, when I started working on the book, much of my thought was approaching it the same as designing great beers, to examine how American homebrewers made these beers.
Yeah, I saw that in the book. You don't necessarily have a lot of specific recipes. Instead, you have more of the Ray Daniels approach, where you provide a percentage, rough percentage guidelines, those kinds of things.
And the exact approach was like Ray did, except he used AHA first round winners. I surveyed homebrewers who would be making these beers. That information is in the book. It ends up not being as important as I thought it would be, because when I went to Belgium, I did not expect for brewers to be as forthcoming with the information as they were. It wasn't any particular magic on my part, other than before I went, I wrote good old-fashioned letters on paper and mailed them. And, because these were, at the time, Rochefort was just, this is 2004, Rochefort was just opening up. And West Fletron had this brief period where they let a few people in to tour. But I really didn't expect they would talk about process as much as they have. To look where you could see their original gravity and their finishing gravity, they would tell you the mash temperatures.
So what did you find out? What were some of the secrets that they shared with you?
Well, they weren't really secrets. They're mashing a good old de Klerk way for the most part, which is a step mash, but they're mashing for attenuation. Same sort of thing you can do, depends upon your system and how carefully you're measuring things, but it's same as mashing it at, say, 146 to 148. So you're getting really good attenuation. Mm-hmm. They talked about their pitching rates, which are scary low, but that's because they have really viable yeast. I wouldn't say you want to try and replicate that unless you're going to Westmalle and actually getting their yeast. In the case of Ockel and West Fletron, that's what they do. When a day they're going to brew, they send a layperson to Westmalle to pick up the yeast. So you found out who was using everybody's yeast, and then talking to them about sugar, which is and this was other Belgian brewers as well. Their sugar is just sugar; it's just sucrose. If you're looking for if you're doing a triple or a golden, in the case of those breweries, they are not looking for any
flavor out of the sugar.
Yeah. No. In other words, nothing unrefined out of the sugar. Mm-hmm. Now there are a lot of home brewers who like that, who want to make their own sugar, their own pale sugar, and add a little bit of color, and that's fine. I mean, when I say that's fine, I mean it is. You should brew to your own taste.
Yeah.
If you're trying to mimic what Westmalle and Chimay and Ockel. You
don't necessarily need to go out and buy a bunch of expensive candy sugar, Belgian candy sugar.
There's no reason. At the time, everything called candy sugar had nothing to do with Belgian sugar. Now, since then, actually, as I was working on the book, Brian Mercer, started writing me emails and asking me what I knew, and we talked about. It's really Rochefort or Gumer Santos gave me the full rundown on which sugars they were using for color. In other words, then you have the unrefined, what's left in the sugar, and the sort of thing like Randy Mosher. It's in Radical Brewing. He has a recipe for making your own sugar, and then a slightly different recipe he gave me for Brew Like a Monk, and you can do that to get the dark sugar, but. In Belgium, they are using confectionery sugar. So Brian has imported a variety of those sugars. If you want color, then his D2, D3, the names change faster than I can keep track of. Those are excellent for if you want to replicate those flavors. You can also, if you live someplace that has Mexican groceries, it's fun to go there and pick those sugars up. You don't know what's in those things, but but you can get some color and you get some neat flavors.
Interesting. So, I mean, just a few minutes ago, you mentioned attenuation and digestibility. Can you tell us, kind of what they mean when they talk about those two terms?
Well, certainly, their digestibility meaning that it goes well with food. Obviously, that it's not going to be heavy on your stomach. And that's another thing because we look at various things and what again, this is just pure luck. As we started talking about target CO2s, which are about twice what people usually expect. So we're talking about 3.5 to 4 volumes.
3.5 to 4 volumes. Wow, that's a lot. That's like a wheat beer. Yeah,
exactly the same as the wheat beers.
I mean, at that rate, you almost have to pour it slowly and then let it settle for a while and then pour a little more? I know they're doing this when I went to Germany.
Not if you've got a well-attenuated beer. But you do need those Belgian-style bottles, or you can have exploding bottles. You think like Prankster from North Coast, that was one of the first breweries to really do that style well. And, they had a real issue. Should we bottle this at the higher CO2? And their heritage bottles are, I think, guaranteed to be good to about 2.5 volumes, and that's why they decided to go to a little less than 2.5 volumes.
So, very highly carbonated, very low mash temperature, high attenuation. You talked about the sugar. Is there any other ingredients or processes that we might want to know about?
Well, process-wise, the other thing is you look and you hear these stories, and it's easy. Well, the three parts, when people lump these together, and you think about the magic of the Belgian brewers, who will always tell you something different every time you ask them a question, and the way they use spices. That's sort of you're crossing some streams there. The Trappist are the Trappist, and that's about it. But and they are not making saisons. They are not saison de pont, where a beer's finishing at 90 degrees. But they at West Flat Run, the beer will get up to about 82 degrees during the course of finishing. Not everybody. West Mall is going to keep it at about 68 the whole time, and that's the same yeast. So you can see how you can treat that yeast in different ways. But one of the most effective ways is to pitch at a relatively low temperature, 62 or 64 degrees. And certainly in a 5-gallon carboy, if you've got a good fermentation going, and you've got a strip on the outside, it's probably going to register about 7 degrees below what's going on inside. And you can see that just swirling around there, and you'll still see your temperature strip going up. So it can naturally, just the heat of fermentation, let's say you keep it in an environment that's 66 degrees, it'll go into the 70s very easily in the course of a few days.
Okay, so when you talk about pitching at, say, 64 degrees, you talk about the internal temperature or the external temperature here?
The temperature of your wort. So I guess you would say the
internal, I guess, yeah.
Yes. So that's what you want to get it going at. Then your external temperature, if you get your external temperature up, it's naturally the other temperature is going to go up. But if you keep that external temperature, certainly below 70, then just the fermentation is going to lift your temperature into the 70s, even as high as 80. But it's not going to do it immediately. If you pitch at 80, you're just going to get Band-Aids and all sorts of ugly flavors. If you let it go up there naturally, then you're going to get the depth of esters that you're looking in these beers. So you're not just getting banana. You let it ramp up too fast. Belgian yeast and Weizen yeast are very similar. Both the isoamyl acetate and the vinyl glycol. The Belgian yeast, in fact, are some of them will throw up even more 4-VG than the Weizen yeast. But you're not doing a ferulic acid rest, so you're not going to promote it as much. But you can get a pretty clovey Belgian beer. If you held that fermentation temperature at 62, 64 all the way through, you get almost no esters, and you get all clove phenols.
So it sounds like what they're doing, they're starting at a fairly low temperature. You mentioned about 64, and then actually allowing it to ramp up naturally as the fermentation proceeds, right?
Right.
And that gives you that range that you need to really develop the fruity esters in the beer, right?
And also to finish off the beer. So where you get that last degree of Plato, that gets you down below 2P.
Because you mentioned earlier, they're all very highly attenuated, right?
Yes. All I think there might be one that's 83, but they're 83 to 90% apparent attenuation.
Okay, so I think we covered some of the basics here. We can't cover everyone in depth, but I was wondering if you could walk us through maybe how you would go about formulating, say, a Dubbel.
The beer I can never get right, so we'll do that one.
Well,
that's so I think no, a Dubbel's fine.
Okay.
But I think you start by asking yourself the question of, what flavors you want in it, and how much banana you want in it, because you certainly aren't going to get as much apples and pears, because your chocolate flavors going to override that a little bit. You need to set aside the idea that Belgian Abbey Ale, which is a great beer, has anything to do with a Belgian Dubbel. It's way too strong, and they use about 5 different spices in it.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of depends what you're drinking and what you're prone to, and what you like. Which in a lot of cases somebody's going to say, well, I really like New Belgium Abbey, which is an excellent beer. I'm not sure what the ABV is, about 7%, so it's not too strong. And so you're going to start with one of the versions of Chimay yeast, which is what New Belgium uses. It came from a Chimay yeast that Jeff LaBeche captured there, cleaned up a little bit, and then I think they re-cleaned it in the early 90s as well.
Mm-hmm.
But you can go with White Labs or Y yeast, both excellent versions of yeast. I would say, you need to use sugar about 10% of the fermentables, so not quite that much percentage-wise of your recipe. Mm-hmm. And you could choose to go with plain white sugar, or if you want to go for color and that little bit of rumminess, which I favor, then I would splurge on one of the Belgian candy syrups. Calls it candy sugar. It's really a syrup. Mm-hmm. D2, D3, and as an alternative, then you could use a little chocolate malt. If I got the D2 or D3, then probably for color and that richness would be more like a dark Munich. Mm-hmm. To add some of that in. Personally, I really like Belgian pale malts
as a base,
and as a blend of the pale and a Belgian Pilsner, mm-hmm. like Castle. Weyermann's really excellent as well. It's a wonderful Pilsner malt. So, if that's what if you keep bags of that around, then going with that is fine. And also, you're going to get a little better utilization with that. The Castle doesn't. You've got to use a little bit more Castle, but it just adds a little richer flavor. Mm-hmm. So and then hopping wise, Dubbels are not particularly hopped. Right. You can go up a little bit higher if you use all noble hops. So if you're going to use something like a Hallertau. I don't think I use one of the Sazerac hops for that. So generally, it's going to be a Hallertau, but that would probably be my choice. Use 2/3 at 60 minutes and 1/3 at 20 minutes. That way, you get to be really traditional. That being the way they do it. Then mash in it at 146, 148.
You mentioned earlier, I think, that they do a multi-step mash in some cases. What are the additional steps they would have?
They'll do 3 or 4. So they'll start at a protein level, mm-hmm. and then lift it 2 times. And
what's the purpose of that? I assume they're using modern malts. Traditionally,
with modern malts, there's a real question of whether that's necessary, because you can over protein rest.
Right.
And that's really an issue anymore with even wheat beers for people. Not for the wheat part, for the other part. And then you start not to get ahead when, the last few weeks, or last month or so, I've judged in 3 homebrew competitions, and we keep pouring wheat beers and there's no head there, and I can't figure out how that's happened.
So obviously you finish off by carbonating it very highly, right? And we talked a little bit about fermentation.
Yeah, just again, depends however you want to, however you usually carbonate your beer. I mean, these are beers that really need to be bottle conditioned. That's the way you get that carbonation, and it's also a different sort of carbonation. So of course your beer's not going to be flat going in, so you've got to do that calculation. But a simple addition of sugar and generally more yeast, I think. So if you're making another batch, you could just crop some yeast off of that. But certainly refreshing your yeast, because we're talking about a beer. Let's say that you started at 18p, and you got it down to 2p. That yeast is already gone through quite a bit. Now you stick it in a bottle, you give it more sugar, and you say, go back to work. It may not do the best job.
So you recommend re-energizing the yeast when you go to carbonate and carbonate.
I recommend new yeast. Either crop from another batch, or just buy a vial and use about half of it.
Now you recommend against Stan. You recommend against carbonating in a keg. Why is that?
Well, because you're trying to get such high carbonation. And another thing, if you're trying to replicate these beers, they get more depth from bottle conditioning.
Makes sense. Now, while researching the book, I understand you actually interviewed a number of the brewers over there. Some of the monk brewers, I guess. Can you share with us a little bit about that experience?
Well, you got there were two. Actually, three monks who were, at the top of the brewing hierarchy at Chimay, Westmalle, and Rochefort. Now, two are Brother Thomas from Westmalle may still be around. I'm not quite sure, but he retired from brewing, so he wasn't there. I met Brother Antoine at Rochefort. He's no longer really involved with the brewing, but he has an office and he has all kinds of mugs there, and he comes into the brewery, and you really get a sense that there's still a lot of oversight just because he's there. But at Westfletrun, the monks are in fact in charge. So I met the one who did the mashing and a few of those other things, and then Brother Joris, who's really the spokesman. When you see somebody quoted from Westfletrun, he's the guy, and he used to be in charge of the lab and checking out the yeast and quality on a daily basis. If they had a severe question, they would ship it to Westmalle, which has a very advanced brewery. There are more than 100,000 barrels, and you look at that bottling line and you think they're like 400,000 barrel brewery.
Wow.
I mean, it's just gigantic. Everything there is oversized, and so he certainly has a good sense of what it takes to brew, but he's not a trained brewer. But more important is even the places where I talk to Monk in charge of marketing at Ockel, is you understand that this making a beer is simply part of what they do. It's part of the monastery culture. It's part of a culture of work. Sometimes when I talk to home brewers, I talk about what I learned there is a sense of the rhythm of the brewery. At Westfletrun, they brew like 35 weeks out of the year, 3 to 4 days a week. They're always bottling the next week because they top crop the yeast to have for the bottle conditioning. Everything is within the rhythm of their lives. And of course, their day includes 7 prayers, 3 of them major prayers. So it has to fit into that basis. And really, the same thing's true of a home brewer. You think you might have a job where you travel, so you can brew on Sunday. You're not going to see your beer until the following Friday evening. Well, you really don't want to be making something that needs to be micromanaged.
Exactly.
Think about what you're making, what your time is, those sort of things. You got 3 soccer games to get to on a Saturday. You're thinking, maybe this is the time to consider some partial mashes as opposed to a full mash. Just those simple sort of things.
That sounds like you had a fantastic experience there.
Yeah, well, it spoiled me. Because when I went to do brewing with wheat, and I go to the German brewers, and tons of people are really forthcoming. At Schneider, Hans Peter tells you everything. But at the larger breweries, they aren't. And and I'm going. I went to these monasteries that are supposed to be super secret, and they don't tell you everything about the ingredients, but they tell you everything about process. And if you know generally what the ingredients are and you know the process, that is much more useful to me. And when people will say the temperature we mash at is proprietary, I guess I roll my eyes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I wanted to actually switch gears here for the last few minutes and talk about your new book, For the Love of Hops. Can you tell us just a little bit about how you got started on that book?
Well, this is the second book in ingredient series, which sometimes I refer to as the Reinheitsgebot series, but I get a lot of blank looks. The first one was yeast, which came out last year. The third one will be water, which John Palmer and Colin Kaminsky are working on. And the second one is For the Love of Hops. And the fourth one will be malt. And I don't know when that's going to happen because I don't think there's an author for that right now. So it's an overview. This is for the Brewers Association, Brewers Publications. So the audience that it's most useful to are small brewers, but there are a lot more home brewers than small brewers. So that's who kind of pays for the book, because you sell more books, and that supports the research. But there are a lot of things like selection, which obviously home brewers aren't going to go up to Yakima and select their hops or have hops sent to them. They're not going to create those relationships with hop farmers. They're not going to get their IBUs constantly analyzed. No. There are a lot of things. Small brewers. Dry hopping is really simple. You drop your hops in. You don't have to be, Lagunitas, which will go past 200,000 barrels this year. 90% of their beer is dry hopped. You've got to come up with it. Dry hopping was invented by putting plugs into firkins. That's kind of small and on a scale. Now, when you're trying to dry hop 180,000 barrels in the course of a year, Lagunitas uses the hop cannon for that, which literally shoots hops in there, and then they rain down through the fermenter.
I like that, the hop cannon.
It's an interesting process. Yeah, it is. Dogfish uses it. Russian River uses it. Firestone's putting it in. So it's a good way to deliver hops in a safer way. When you've got a 300-barrel fermenter asking somebody to go to the top, you've got to get them up there. When you open that, you've just got tons of CO2 blowing off. If you drop the hops in, then literally they can blow somebody off. You need to harness them in. So there's a safety factor. So the book looks at those sort of things, but it looks in depth. So there's a discussion of hop breeding, because everybody's interested in these new varieties and where are we going to go. Aroma hops and the special aroma hops or flavor hops, whichever name you want to give them. That would be Citra. That'd be the new hop Mosaic. which is, most people know by the number 369 right now. They're just putting the name to it, and it will be available after this harvest season. Brewers have it now, Russian River has it now, and New Glarus has a contract for it. And there'll be a few people using it, but for the most part, it's new. It has a blueberry note to it, is what people notice. Galaxy out of Australia. Some of the hops coming out of New Zealand. So these hops with interesting character, and how have we bred them, and how do they come about? Hop farmers and the relationship between brewers. So it really is the whole spectrum of the hops, with a lot of emphasis on aroma, obviously, and what happens in the kettle, which we understand bitterness better, but we obviously do not perfectly understand bitterness.
Well, can you provide just a few tips? We only got a minute or two left, but can you provide a few tips for those of us looking to get the most out of our hops, particularly for home brewers?
Well, I think it depends when you say get the most out of your hops. Obviously, dry hopping gives you a lot of the hop character. To draw an analogy with the Belgian beers, one thing I suggest is in using the Belgian beers in doing Belgian beers is to pick one yeast and get to know that yeast well. For one thing, you can repitch it and use it at different strengths. Make a 4 or 5% beer with that yeast. Then make stronger beers with the yeast, play with temperatures and things like that, and get to know one particularly. So the same thing is true with the hop varieties. Pick a few and get to know them, because rubbing them and trying them in dry hop, you're going to get a much different character than you are using them in brewing. Those flavors and the oxidized flavors that come across. Some things are cautionary. It's exciting to get those flavors, and so making beers totally with late hopping, say 20 minutes in, 10 minutes in the dry hop, then if you're just bombarding the beer with hops, it doesn't matter. But you're going to lose what people are just beginning to understand, which is the kettle hop flavor, and that's created by glycosides. And if you're not creating glycosides, you're not going to get the kettle hop flavor.
I assume those are those fragile sort of hop oils that tend to boil off very quickly.
Well, it's not really from the hop oils. It's splitting off. So it is an oxidized character, but it is different than the hop oils, and that's why it's been so elusive. And of course, the other thing is when you all the late hopping, then you're not getting the ISO. And the ISO is not just for bitterness. It also is certainly affecting your foam. So all of a sudden, when you're judging beer competitions and you're pouring IPAs without a head or that don't keep the head, you're going, geez, what did they use in this beer? So all of that there are a lot of exciting hops out there, but I would say explore them one at a time.
Yeah, we had Charlie Bamforth on, I think it was last fall, talked about how important hops are to foam. He actually did a whole episode on foam.
Well, it is. I mean, there's and to your stability. Hops got selected about 1,000 years ago, they really took over 1,300, because they were the best thing. They made beer better, and you could ship beer, and
real
that's where they
preservative,
went out. And there were only certain flavors and aromas that people were interested in, and that part is broadened, but it's important to remember the basic utility of the hop.
Well, Stan, when's your book coming out?
It should be at GABF.
GABF, so that'll be in September,
early October, actually.
October time frame. So.
Yeah, I don't know that it'll ship before then. That's a sort of, when they come around that time, then BP likes to introduce them at GABF. Just like the IPA book, Mitch Steele and Steve Wagner's book will be at NHC, and that'll sort of be where it debuts, and then it'll ship after that.
Well, Stan, thank you very much for being on the show. I really appreciate you being here.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
And I hope you can come back in the fall and maybe talk a little more about your new book.
That'll be perfect.
That'd be great.
All right.
And again, that was Stan Hieronymous, who has a website at AppalachianBeer.com. He's the author of several books, Brew Like a Monk, Brewing with Wheat, and also For the Love of Hops. Well, I'd like to thank Stan one more time for appearing on the show. I'd like to thank you for listening. If you have any feedback for the show, you can leave it at BeerSmith.com/blog under this episode, or you can go to the BeerSmith discussion forum at BeerSmith.com/forum. I really appreciate you listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.